Good morning, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to our Climate Challenge Fund gathering for 2020. It's obviously a shame we can't meet in person, but I hope you'll find actually this platform actually a fantastic way to engage across all the activities and speeches that we have for you today. I'd like to say a massive thank you to our team for pulling together such a varied programme of brilliant keynotes, informative workshops, and interactive tabletop discussions. And I suppose for me, this is importantly a very good investment in all of our time to try and interact with each other, share stories, share good practice, and learn from each other. We have a brilliant programme today, and I'm extremely grateful to the speakers who are joining us. George Marshall, Michaela Loach, the Cabinet Secretary, Rosanna Cunningham, and finally with Alistair McIntosh later this afternoon. But in between all that, of course, as I say, we have a fantastic range of workshops. I think from a Keep Scotland Beautiful's perspective, we very much have sort of five key things that we're trying to hope that you get from the event. Clearly, learning is at the heart of what we're doing today. A great opportunity to learn from each other, and the range of CCF groups right across the country. And I think probably inspiring each other. I think where we've particularly groups have found innovative solutions, particularly at a community level, would love to be able to use this event to share that. I think also there's an element that we want people to feel stretched in their thinking, maybe challenged somewhat, and think differently about their own projects. And that's, of course, where great learning takes place. Networking, of course, potentially through this platform presents challenges, but actually, my experience, I've used this platform before. I've actually found it a great way to meet probably perhaps you just wouldn't have spoken to at a coffee or a tea stand. So please do take that opportunity to press the networking button and see if you can meet people you've never met before. And of course, finally, and most importantly, this is a moment to celebrate, of course, all the achievements right across the CCF network. It's an extraordinary network, an extraordinarily creative, innovative, determined and committed network. And I'm sorry I haven't, in my first year as Chief Executive of Keep Scotland Beautiful, not had the opportunity to meet more of you in person. But what I have done is certainly, be looking forward to today to really invest in my time to learn more about what you're doing. So I'm looking forward to the day. I hope you are too. And I'm now delighted to pass on to Alistair, who'll give you some details about some of the key housekeeping elements for today.
Thank you, Barry, and I can add my welcome as well. It's great to have so many people here. I was just looking at some of the chat as you arrived in the reception, and great to see that typical CCF energy and buzz in the room. And so a few quick domestics from me. Hopefully you've worked the technology out by now, but if you're having any trouble, our friends from Cameron Live, who are hosting the event, have a stall in the marketplace, and you'd be very welcome to drop in there at any point, and they will sort you out. They do assure us that 95% of issues can be resolved by using Google Chrome, so please bear that in mind. We're recording much of today so that people who can't join us can catch up later. And we're sharing more information about how we use that recording in the reception. There's a notice there. But just to say, the only way you could possibly appear in a recording is if you ask to share your screen in a workshop setting at the question time. The moderators in the workshops will explain more, but please bear that in mind that if you want to come on screen, you will be recorded. If you ask a question in the chat box, the moderator reads that out. They're highly likely to mention your name, and again, that will be recorded, so please bear that in mind if you want to ask a question. Please share all the good things that are happening today through social media. Those of you who are good at doing that, using the hashtag CCFGathering20, and Tim will pop the details of that in the chat box so you don't forget. But please do share what's going on today. We trust you know where your nearest toilet is, where your nearest fire escape is. There are no fire alarms planned for today, so please take those seriously. We would love to know where you're all from and where you're joining us from today. So we want to get a little bit of interactive participation going. So your first task, and you'll see in the top right-hand corner of your screen, there is a polls button. So could you navigate, please, to that poll? And shortly there'll be an opportunity for you to tell us which local authority area you are from. We'd love to know. And I'm guessing maybe others are also curious like me and would like to see who's in the room. So could you do that now, please? Head over to polls and click on that and tell us where you're from. And it'll be lovely to see who is all in the room just now. While you are doing that, I want to share another opportunity for a bit of audience participation. We would love to see the view from your window this morning, whether that's a spectacular view, a boring view, an exciting view, a view with a cat in it. And we just want to get that sense of being together from across Scotland. So if you would like to do that, there are two ways you can do that. You can do that by tweeting a photograph using hashtag CCF Gathering View. And again, Tim will put the details of that in the chat box for us. Or you can email a photograph, and again, Tim will pop the details of that in the chat box. What we would like to do later on in the day is show some of those photographs here on the main stage. So please only do that if you're happy for your photograph to be shared and to be recorded and to be available for people to see in future. And please, of course, make sure you have the permission of any people or cats that appear in your photograph that they are happy to do that. Okay, I think we are now through the domestics for the day, and it's my great privilege to welcome our first speaker, George Marshall. George is a leading authority on communicating about climate change, particularly to people who are perhaps skeptical or disinterested or just too busy to care. George is author of a really important book, Don't Even Think About It, a book about why our brains are hardwired to ignore climate change. That's a book that lives pretty much permanently on our desks in our office at KSB. George is also founder of Climate Outreach, a British charity that's dedicated to building cross-societal support for action on climate change through really good quality, effective communication. And we're delighted that George is here to share some insights from research that he and his team have carried out, from psychologists, that we hope will help all of us become more effective in communicating about climate change to the people we work with in our communities. After George has spoken, there will be an opportunity for some questions and answers. So if you have a question that you would like to ask George, then please pop it in the chat box as he's speaking. And Barry will then field some of those questions to George, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. So this is your opportunity to ask a question to the guru of climate communication. So please do be doing that. Well, without further ado, I'm delighted now to hand over to George Marshall.
Thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me to this. It's a real privilege to be speaking with you today. As I make my presentation, please do make any comments or questions you like in the chat, because I'm going to be following that, and that then can be the basis of what I hope will be a really strong Q&A session that we can do afterwards. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about communicating the climate emergency. I think it's really important we start off with communications with some core principles. People have a right to know. They have a fundamental right to know about anything which is going to have a severe effect on their lives, especially climate change. And that's a moral right, and it's a legal right. Let's talk morally. If people do not know about climate change, if they are in a state of unwitting ignorance, they will not be prepared, they will not be making informed decisions, which might be about their jobs, where they live, the decisions they make. It might also be voting decisions, for example. And as a result, we could say that the impacts of climate change will be amplified by a lack of knowledge. So there's a core moral principle here. People should always know about something which is coming down the line and is going to affect their lives. But this is also being amplified, of course, with grassroots movements. This is Extinction Rebellion in taking over Oxford Circus in London, demands to tell the truth. There's a widespread feeling amongst activists in particular, and certainly I share this view, that actually people have been willfully and deliberately underinformed. So we're not just saying misinformed of active climate denial, but people are underinformed, but people know far too little about this. And I must say, I'm very disturbed when I travel around the world. We've done focus groups in India and in the Middle East, but people are going to be severely affected by climate change, seem to have very little understanding of what is happening. But there's a legal right to know. This is much less known about. But enshrined in international law is the right to know about climate change. The Framework Convention, back in 1992, specifically has an article dedicated to this, saying that parties, let's say governments, will educate and inform the public, and, this is very interesting, demand that they will ensure public participation in policy formation. Now, that language is very largely repeated in the Paris Agreement, and it appears in several places in the Paris Agreement. Again, so governments have a legal responsibility to inform, educate, and involve their citizens in climate change. And this has been very, very poorly implemented. Scotland, as I'll say later on, is in some ways actually quite a leading country in this. But generally speaking, across the world, governments have really failed to meet their legal obligations. Now, there's a legal right and there's a moral right, but there is also a fundamental necessity that people understand climate change. In essence, I'd probably say this, that we will not be able to meet our climate targets unless people understand what is happening and that there is a mandate, that is to say, that they're giving their political space for those actions to happen. And this is really at two levels. There's the first one, which is these large-scale macro projects affecting the entire economy, where there's going to be costs, there's going to be disruption, it's going to be destabilizing in order to implement the low-carbon economy. And of course, for transition for people in fossil fuel industry, that's going to be extremely hard. So that requires a political mandate. But also, by any of the analysis, whether it's the IPCC, whether it's the Committee on Climate Change in the UK, a large part of the delivery of our carbon targets is in the hands of individuals. And people are not going to make the lifestyle changes which are necessary, the voluntary lifestyle changes, unless they're on board. That's why we're using this language here of a mandate. There's the mandate is where we all come together. We say, despite our differences, different ways of seeing the world, we are all going to agree that this is an overarching problem for all of us. And this is why it has to be broad-based. It has to cross all of those demographic, political, attitudinal barriers which block people. And if you don't do it, then you get this kind of thing. This is in Australia. This is when Australia tried to implement really quite a modest carbon pricing policy. And it faced mass rebellion, and it became a political football. It got picked up by Tony Abbott when he was coming into, and effectively led to the fall of the Labour government. This is in a way the harvest of years and years of failure to invest in broad-based public engagement. Not dissimilarly, in France, the carbon pricing was the spark which initiated much wider issues concerning malcontent and distrust in government, which launched the Gilets jaunes protests. That's, again, a carbon pricing initiative, a climate change initiative, got completely sucked into much wider political storms, rather than sitting outside it and saying, well, despite our political differences, then climate change is one of these non-negotiable issues we all have to work together on. So that's ultimately the aim of public communications and engagement, is to bring people together around a shared sense of common purpose. The problem is we're quite a long way away from that. Again, this is the product of years of actual failure of government communications. This is a kind of glass half full, glass half empty situation. It depends whether you want to be positive or whether you want to be optimistic or pessimistic. You can look at the figures, you can say, actually, there is an increasing level of concern, and in all countries in the world, the majority of people state in surveys that they're very concerned about climate change. We have to be very careful with this. We would say, not that people don't know, but that their understanding is shallow. People are far less inclined to say that climate change is one of their primary concerns, although this has shifted quite significantly over time. And then when you get down into the details of what do you think is causing climate change and what are the effects you think it will have on your lives, then we find that actually the understanding is really shallow. And here's some figures, for example, from this is Ipsos Mori research done for the Scottish government. So if we say a full understanding of climate change is that human activity is entirely responsible which is for scientific truth, small minorities of people understand that. The vast majority of scientists agree. We're still just pushing over a third of people. So like 2/3 of people still don't understand the level of a scientific consensus. The sense of being directly affected, for example, by flooding, is much lower than the science tells us it will be. Those figures, by the way, saying S in brackets is for Scotland. 42% of people in Scotland think climate change will have little or no impact on their lives. Well, I'm sorry, but I think the evidence suggests very, very differently. There is a fundamental psychological problem with climate change that people distance it. But they say climate change, sure, that's a big problem. I'm concerned about that. But ultimately, it's going to affect somebody else in another country or someone further away or someone in the future. And although this is getting less so now, it's still quite prevalent. As you're seeing, some demographics are much less involved. Within Scotland, for example, over a quarter of men think the issue has been exaggerated. Older demographics too. Again, similar figures for people over the age of 55. And we're seeing over 75%, nearly half of people think it's not urgent. And people with lower incomes or lower levels of education think it's not urgent. And again, those are figures for Scotland. Now, the fact that maybe in some of these situations, the majority of people are concerned doesn't help us if we do not have a mandate, because we're opening up there the possibility of opposition, a political opposition, people being mobilized in order to oppose climate action if they don't understand or accept. And as you see here, quite a lot of people thinking we're not going to reach our target. So we have a suspicion and in some ways a distrust of ability of reaching our targets. Now, the fact is that the governments do know what to do, and governments routinely invest in public engagement. So here again, we have another case which we have to be making at a higher level of saying, look, we really have to invest in communicating and engaging with people. We have to be reaching out to people. And that means supporting and funding your work, supporting, as indeed has happened, and again, Scotland is very unusual in this, of putting substantial amounts of money over the years in supporting things like, the Climate Initiative and KSB. This has to, though, move up a step. I mean, let's look at, for example, the amount of money that the Scottish Government has spent on COVID. This was Freedom of Information Initiative, a request from the Scotsman newspaper. Back in July, so remember, this is now all out of date, by that point, £5.7 million have been spent by the Scottish Government on COVID spending, including this advert. This is a kind of, in truth, this is a kind of level of funding we need to be seeing for public communications on climate change, which is a major issue, including a major health issue. Within the UK as a whole, I'm thinking here of the national Westminster spending on communications. We haven't been able to find a single budget line for spending on climate change, communications, engagement of the central government communications budget. So we have a way to go on this. And of course, if we look at commercial levels, you have a situation, for example, in 2018, where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced the 1.5 degree report. And they had a budget for promoting that of $158,000. During the same year, Coca-Cola spent $4 billion on advertising and marketing. So the disproportionality of climate change is a serious issue. As I said, we are going to be investing billions and billions and billions in a shift to the low carbon economy. We've surely got to be able to be finding some tens of millions for investing in public understanding of why that is necessary. So let me say a little bit about climate outreach and what we do. What I've been sharing with you so far is really our ambition, what we do as an organization. Our goal is to build that broad-based public mandate. And we do so by doing the research and finding out what essentially is required in order to achieve that. This is my colleagues and my team, and I'm glad to say we're now leaders in Europe, certainly in this issue of broad-based public communications. We have a lot of clients, including, I'm glad to say, the Scottish Government, but a lot of international clients working with big organizations across many, many different sectors. And please do go to our website. The material we produce is there for public use. It's there for sharing and for being used. and a lot of it is designed for helping organizations like yourselves, people who are struggling with finding ways of communicating, to provide practical tools and toolkits for how to do it. As far as possible, everything that we produce is shared. I'd like to also draw your attention, we've done a lot of work on visual images. For the first time ever, testing what images work or don't work, and developing actually a large library of licensed, unlicensed, free-to-use material that you can use in your own work. We're really excited a lot of this is now being picked up and used by communicators. So please have a look at the library, take that material and use it, knowing that it's been carefully tested and selected for effectiveness. So let's have a look and see what our research is telling us. What is strong communications? How do we build that broad-based public mandate? Well, it's pretty clear from the research that facts and figures are important. The underlying science is important, but it doesn't shift views. In other words, people have an attitude that they already hold in the form often of stories. We are storytelling animals. Stories appear in every culture. They're kind of hardwired into our psychology. What people tend to do, they develop the stories which speak to their values and their identity, and then they find the facts to fill in. It is not enough simply to throw information at people and assume that sticks, unless it resonates with them in terms of the story and the narrative they tell themselves. And here, of course, is a classic example of facts and figures, in this case, entirely spurious ones, being used for a wider narrative at the bottom of the Brexit battle bus. Let's take back control. That's the story. Then people find the facts and figures to fit, including, I might say, very well-educated and well-informed people. Because it's also important to note that lack of understanding of climate change is not necessarily about education. Very educated people can be entirely wrong about things because they're following the wrong story. So we could say this in another way. This is research we did for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We'd say, well, you do a science, we do a science. Communications is a science, it's an evidence-based science. This is from the report we wrote from them. That climate change is understood as a socially constructed narrative. So looking for stories conveyed by trusted communicators. That is so important. If you don't know whether something is right or not, you ask, is the person telling me somebody who knows and can be trusted? And those stories, that narrative, that has to reflect people's identity and validate their values. So not just validate, not just reflect their values, but validate, to say who you are, what you believe in. These things are important, worthwhile, and so are you. In fact, we can even sort of have a formulation that starts by reflecting at people, this is who you are, and what you are is really worthwhile, is really valid and important. Reflects back to them, this is what you care about, and these things are worth caring about because they're important. It shows them a social norm. Other people around you like you. They agree with you and care about this. Because the reward, the ultimate reward for taking action on climate change, of taking action in your life, for turning down your heating, for maybe not flying for that holiday, whatever, the things, or for voting for a party to take strong action, is that when you do that, that is who you are. And when you do that, you become more who you are. And through those actions, the world becomes more the way you want it to be, recognizing that for each different group and different audience, the actual application of this formula will be different. The way they want the world to be will be different. The group they identify will be different. The people they look to for the social confirmation will be different. So when we do social research, we'd go, and our starting questions are actually never about climate change. It would be, tell us about yourself, what makes you proud, what's important to you, what do you care about? Because it's only on the basis of that that we construct the narratives on climate change. The big mistake I think we've made as communicators and activists for years is by projecting who we are, what we care about, onto the issue, and then saying, there you go, it's important, without recognizing that other people have very different ways of seeing the world. The trusted messengers is really important. As I've said, it is, in the end, the messenger is often more important than the message. And you'll see I've put in the Climate Challenge Fund in there as well, because I think one of the things that's made the fund and your work so important and valuable is that you've been working in local communities with local trusted messengers, which is the absolute key. Really, if we were in a position that governments were fulfilling their commitments to engage with the public, it would not in the end be through an advertising campaign, although that might be useful. It would in the end be by enabling, supporting and empowering people within lots of different networks and different communities to do what they're doing. And within the climate challenge, you have been doing that, and in many cases doing it very effectively. Really, the question and challenge is how can we upscale that, keep making that bigger and invest further in it. So a few of the things we've learned from our research, just picking it out. The really important thing, as we all know, is we have to start speaking to wider audiences. I already showed you in Scotland, for example, that there are some demographics who are frankly skeptical of climate change or just not involved or think it's exaggerated. We have to find a way of speaking to mainstream values, and in particular, I'd say that that's values what we could say are centre right. The reason for that, I mean, here's a bit of research of looking at studies across 56 countries, is you'll see there of the various things which influence people's attitudes to climate change. Gender has a difference, people's age has a difference, young people far more mobilized than older people, income, education, all of these things. Politics screams out as being the biggest single influence on people's attitudes to climate change. That doesn't necessarily mean voting politics. People with conservative values, for example, can sometimes vote for left-wing parties. It's their political ideology, it's their core political values. So we have to find ways of speaking better to those. And this is something which within climate outreach we've done a lot of work on, and please do have a look at our resources on our website for more information on that. Part of speaking to those wider values, and we have found this across hundreds of workshops we run called narrative workshops, which are a form of focus group, is that actually people's real interests and concerns, not surprisingly, tend not to be about the environment. So we need to find ways of taking climate change out of this environmental box. The big danger is, of course, if we call it environmental or green, we attract for people who are very drawn towards those issues, which I'm sure includes many of us, certainly me, but it actually tends to alienate the people who do not identify with that. So obviously, health, security, seriously underplayed as a climate change issue. Yes, economy, food, you can see all of the lists there, but also wider things, family, faith values, fantastic opportunities to communicate and engage with people through their faith. Effects on the heritage, on the landscape, on their sense of identification with their country. And wider values about fairness or about freedom or about independence. All of these are very important values for people. Health I'd certainly highlight because this is one of the areas where we know we can reach across wider audiences, where there will be health impacts from climate change, but also some of the measures to deal with climate change, in particular transport electrification, will have major positive health benefits. And actually, one of the strongest messages, for example, moving to a low carbon economy is cleaning up the air and the health benefits, actually far more than climate change for many people. Here, for example, is a program that we helped to design but ran with a climate coalition, which brings together all of the UK organisations that work on climate change, including many such as the National Trust, which work with very mixed and broad audiences, called For the Love Of, in which people talk in their own words about the things they care about and their concerns of what might happen to those things under the effects of climate change. So we're talking here about things much wider than environment. Somebody's done Leeds United football team. Someone's done, people do chocolate, lots of different things. They're speaking in their own words too. So people are communicating as trusted messengers. You can see who they are. You can see that they're people like you. You can trust what they say. This has been very successful. This has been running for over 10 years now. We actively helped the Climate Coalition go and find messaging which worked for a broad audience. And that, I suggest for you, should be a starting point for any communications. Who are we speaking to with this? Who does it work for with this? Are we reaching those people who might be concerned but currently aren't hearing it in a story or values that they really appreciate. Here's a wider issue in terms of speaking to the centre right. We find actually that words around constructions of here's Stephen Harper, himself a climate skeptic, speaking to a British Parliament, and his speech is just littered with these words: rediscover, reward, return. This language is the kind of thing which signals to people of more conservative values that you're speaking their values, because redoing things is about recognizing there are things we can learn in the past, but we need to return to. Therefore, words of this kind are ones where they go, yeah, that's speaking to me and my values and who I am. This, for example, is a program that we helped design for Tear Fund. Now, Tear Fund are very interesting because they work with evangelicals on development and environment issues, and many of those people are conservative. And the language, which again has been very successful for them, is around using these words. We've just incidentally doing a program with the Colombian government where apparently works in Spanish as well. So restore, reforest, rethink, renew, reduce. As in reduction of emissions, is now the branding for their national carbon pricing program. And it's the first time we've ever been involved in anything which comes with its own merchandise. But you see what we're doing with that. We're trying to find things which reach the wider audience in terms of the framing and the language that we're using. Caring for people, so important. Rather than talking about adaptation, I hate this technical word. Talk about protecting, caring, and preparing, because that is who we are. So a very effective way of engaging with people in more conservative or rural audiences is to talk, for example, about when flooding. So you remember when we had that flooding, we really showed how we came together as a community then. We did a lot for each other. We supported, we cared for the vulnerable. Well, those impacts are coming. There's going to be more of those with climate change, and we have to be ready for those in order to prepare for those impacts. Not talking about big businesses, talking about small businesses, showing individual workers talking in their own words about what they're doing, about how their work is worthwhile, about how proud they are of what they do. Big mistake to think that we have to talk about the opportunities for large businesses as if that mobilizes conservatives. It doesn't. Grassroots people of more mainstream or centre-right values are mobilized about stories of people making a go of it for themselves, starting their own businesses, employing young people, like getting new skills. That's what's engaging. And finally, finding a way to speak to our shared identity of who we are across all boundaries. So I guess the question in Scotland is, Scotland has a very strong sense of identity of what it is. What can we pull out from that as ways of talking about climate change, transition, and preparation that speaks to a shared sense of who you are? We know in wartime that we routinely talk about this shared purpose. We've seen it also with COVID too, a sense that we can do it together. The thing I like about this American messaging in the Second World War is that it's about coming together across divides, left and right, management and worker, women, black people, white people. We all have our differences and our divisions, but together we can do it. That's kind of powerful. Here's a project that we did with the Welsh government, trying to find ways of talking about sustainable development and climate change which spoke to a sense of national language and identity. And we started by going out and talking and listening, saying, what makes you proud of Wales? What do you care about? What are the things which are important to you in your community? We even tried to rename in our recommendations, the government didn't go for it, unfortunately, sustainable development using a Welsh word, bodlondeb, which is a Welsh word meaning contentedness you find in your family and community. In other words, could we rethink the entire language of what we were talking about? What was interesting was that when we tested the existing narratives around that the Welsh government was using, we found that people hated it. Nobody had ever tested it before. But we found, for example, that you'd say to them, hey, we can have smart modern electric cars. And people would say, well, I can't afford the car I've got now. Why are you telling me these things? I don't see these new jobs. We don't want to be a leader. What was interesting was that the mainstream government narratives failed. And the result of that, in part, was mass opposition to wind farms, because people did not feel involved. You'll see that sign there, "We in Mid Wales love our land." In other words, that people's own identity and connection and values were being overruled by the government policy. And this, I might say, is exactly what happens if we do not build that broad mandate. People will resist because they will find that their own identity is stronger in resistance than it is in compliance. That's deadly. What we also found, and this will apply also to Scotland, is that people felt that the new low carbon economy and the messaging was fundamentally undermining their sense of shared identity around their industrial heritage. And therefore, the messaging we needed was something which reinforced and validated that, but recognized and respected the role that coal mining in particular had played in creating the national wealth in Wales. But then saying, hey, we've done that before, we have built natural resources, and Wales is a resource economy in many ways, but now we have natural resources for new challenges. In other words, this is not a break with the past. We are not undermining or devaluing the past. It's a continuity of what we do well. This model applies in many, many other places. We've now taken this around the world. We've worked, for example, with groups across India. We've worked with groups just recently across North Africa and the Arabic-speaking regions. And of particular interest, I think, for what we're talking about here, in Alberta, a country which is built on oil. In each of these cases, we've been working with and training organizations to go and run groups where they listen to what people think, so they can understand their values, and then can we build ways of talking that speak to people who they are and what they really care about. One thing which we find in all of those situations, interestingly, I think it's almost probably, we may well find that it's a global constant, is that language about things being easy is disregarded. Language about saying that this is difficult, these changes will not be easy, that this is hard, but that we in our culture, in our country, in our community can take on the challenge, but we think is effective and powerful language, because it is validating and reinforcing people's sense of local pride, less making it realistic that it's hard. And it seems counterintuitive, but saying that something is difficult garners stronger support than saying that it's easy. So, for example, in Alberta, we were finding that that the language which was necessary for building support with the people who were very strongly invested in the oil industry was a recognition of the work that had happened within the oil and gas industry. In the course of our work there, we had over 500 people involved in these climate change conversations. We didn't find a single person who was not themselves or members of their family or their friends involved in the oil industry. So you have to start with that as a beginning. But the language there was one of dependency, was insecurity, interestingly. It was not really about environment. The concern that the oil industry had taken over their lives, but actually that they were constantly on this roller coaster. These were the words they themselves used, going up and down with the oil prices. And I think there's similar messaging we could try in Scotland. But our dependence on the fossil fuel economy is an insecure one. It's one which leaves us vulnerable. It's one where it's hard to plan for the future. You must have had similar things in Scotland with the effects of the oil pricing on how that affects the Scottish economy. And that therefore renewables is much more reliable, is a safer place for us to be. I should say, moving forward now for opportunities for Scotland, well, Glasgow, of course, let's flag it up. I was at Copenhagen for COP15, and these pictures are taken from Copenhagen. The entire city got turned into almost a climate theme park. So here's some questions maybe we could take into the discussion. Could Scotland be a global leader in public engagement? I believe that a lot of what you have done already is actually very powerful, and certainly we want to share that very widely. But there needs to be more. there needs to be a sustained and increased program in public engagement in every country, and you're just simply ahead of the game, but you're not there yet. Is there a Scottish meta-narrative? Is there a way that people in Scotland share values and identity that could be the basis of broad-based public engagement? And if there is, what would it look like? You tell me. What do you think are the things which make Scotland really proud of people in Scotland really proud of who they are? And this question here as to whether the changes from climate change are not a break with the past, but a continuity, that there's something could be rooted in a sense of that national identity and part of a wider story about the national journey over time, a country with very strong sense of its past, but it has a future which is also a continuity built on those values and that identity. Thank you so much.
George, thank you. What a fantastic first session. I mean, I think, as I said at the start, I think you wanted to achieve many things, and that was right in the stretch bubble of our thinking, and I think that's so important for us all. I mean, it's a topic I'm extremely interested in. Is how in some ways it's how we use our resources really, really effectively in terms of that communication message. I'm sure you've been watching the chat coming in. George, there's been some fantastic questions, but I wonder if could I take you back, building actually on a comment from Graham Marshall, and to be quite topical, and specifically looking at those the lessons that we can learn from some of the COVID communications that have come out. And have you looked at that? Have you thought about if there's any lessons that we can draw from that, either good or bad?
Can we? Am I coming through? Okay, good. I think that the COVID, yes, well, I think the positive thing we can see with COVID communications is this sense of we're all in this together. We've seen that this principle of fairness has come through extremely strongly. We've had cases, Scotland and England, of high-profile people who appear to have broken all the laws, and that has really triggered things for people. So I think in terms of both climate change policy, but also in communications, fairness is absolutely essential. And it's clear that in terms of its mandate, that people will accept having, if it's presented properly, that they will accept having major implications on their life, providing it is fair. And the fairness has to be built in from day one. In fact, actually, we need to highlight that in our communications. I mean, we do, for example, with carbon pricing, we found that the messaging which often works best is to say this is a fair way because the people who produce the most pollution are the ones who have to make the greatest contribution. Indeed. And I think we can also say that we'll have to see, I mean, we need an analysis after the event, but we will certainly see that there have been some major failure communications during COVID, not just in communicating the science, but I think also in terms of communicating the purpose and the reason for taking part. And I think failing to recognize, as we've said there, that you have a meta-narrative, you had a broad-based thing of saying this is a national problem we all need to pull together. But my kids, for example, are teenagers. They need a different focused communication for them and for their values, because they see this issue very differently. COVID, for example, very differently from, let's say, retired people. And therefore, the messaging needs to be different. And I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing the breakdown into segments. I think it's been quite poorly designed as a communication strategy.
Thanks, George. I mean, I guess building on that, there's been a couple of comments in the chat box, probably touching on what you were talking about, but that differential with some of older people in the population. Do you have any sense about why the evidence is pointing to older people being more sceptical around climate change?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you would think that old people, I mean, if you speak with them, old people are very aware of changes in the weather. I mean, old people are like little, are kind of like capsules of climate knowledge, really. But I think climate change, I think especially for mitigation aspects, the idea that what we are doing is causing this damage is a fundamental breach with the contract that people enter into. And I think this applies to a lot of environmental issues. But for older people who lived in many ways in a much more secure and stable world, I mean, in bad ways as well as good, but like where there was a set of rules and where you the understanding was that you worked hard, you made your contribution, you did the right things, you paid your taxes, and then at the end of all of this, you would be, you had a right to receive a pension, but it was all mapped out that way. But to have a situation where you say, actually, this is a change of the rules, but what you think is good isn't good, and no, you're actually going on a cruise or having a holiday, but that's actually going to destroy the world. And especially, of course, for people who've worked in the fossil fuel industry or cars or any of these things, I think for them it's deeply, deeply undermining. And I think in the same way as other major social shifts. I mean, my concern, for example, is that big social shifts in attitudes towards, say, gender or sexual orientation or race, however fast we push them through, and they've moved really fast, so it's very encouraging to see how fast social change can happen. But in the end, it actually tends to happen that they become introduced at the bottom with younger people, and then they work their way through. And I fear with climate change, of course, if we had a couple of generations, well, I wouldn't have any worries about this. But we've already wasted a generation by not moving fast enough. And of course, what we're seeing is exactly that. But the young people who are now coming online are the ones who've had climate change in their science education at school, and they're much, much more alert to it. I think, yes. I think for older people, I think it's I think it's one thing. I think it's one thing too many. I mean, as I say in my book, we are in some ways wired not to accept climate change for a whole lot of reasons, and it's, in a way, it's too challenging because it undermines a lot of your fundamental understanding of how the world works.
Thanks, George. And you touched on young people there. There's been actually quite a few comments in the chat box that there's not enough going on to communicate to young people in schools. Now, at this point, I'll gratuitously plug Keep Scotland Beautiful's work around climate-ready classrooms. I'm contractually obliged, George, but in the broader sense, what opportunities, or what's your view of the type of education or the messages young people are receiving, and the work that we should all be thinking about in there?
Yes, I'm not. It's not an area that I specialize in, so I won't say much on it. I think it's in the curriculum. I think that's important, but I think that the level of engagement also needs to be broader than that. That this isn't just a dry kind of like science, geography, social studies kind of area, but it's actually something where children are encouraged and supported to think in a constructive way about how, but constructive, again, say there are opportunities in this as well as constraints about how this might change their life choices. So I'm not aware, for example, that climate change is a consideration in careers advice, or in helping young people to find their way. And I'd like to see it much more as a toolkit. As I said, kind of like with this thing, like people have a right to know because people need to make informed decisions at all levels. And it needs to be something which is built into education as a way of, this is going to be a major variable in your life. So this is how to build it in and how to work it into the decisions that you make. I think also enabling through school, and especially outside of school, for young people to talk with each other. I mean, we've seen a big change in this actually over the last few years. I mean, a few years ago, when I looked at the social research, young people, we did some research ourselves talking with young people. They were very unwilling to communicate with each other about climate change. There was a social taboo about it. I think movements like Fridays for the Future have opened up much more acceptability for young people to talk with each other. But I am concerned that when they leave school, it kind of shuts down again. So the question, not just for young people, but for all groups, is how do we enable and catalyze and support people's capacity to speak with each other, either within their own immediate peer group and their age group, but also within families. And I think Scotland has done this. We did some work also with Scottish government on this, on how to enable climate change conversations. So I think this is and young people then can be. I see young people amongst all the many things which they bring as having the capacity to go in and to seed and initiate those kinds of conversations in the workplace or within their families or within their own networks, but they need to be tooled and supported and encouraged to do so, or else they'll feel shut down. You can imagine, if we do meet up over Christmas, I would love to see young people feeling that they have the confidence and power to have a conversation with older family members about why climate change is important, but they need to be supported to do that.
George, you picked up strongly that the sort of Scottish narrative, if you like, or we're certainly keen to explore that, and you were pointing that in the questions at the end. But just picking up a kind of an interesting comment from Bill Slee on the chat box about the fact that there's actually probably quite a few people on the call who are aiming to do quite a lot of work around climate change, but actually live in an area that's probably economically at least dominated by oil and gas, and maybe some of the challenges there. Have you got experience or some thoughts around developing dialogue in similar areas?
I think I think it starts with a dialogue. As a lifelong environmentalist, but also as somebody who's on my family side, we're in coal mining for generations. I have always been disturbed by the lack of willingness to engage with fossil fuel communities, and that is also of the environmental movement. I'm generalizing largely here, but and I think also sometimes a lack of respect. The major anti-coal campaign which has been running across Europe, I was deeply shocked when I did an analysis of their materials to find no pictures or images or reference whatsoever to coal mining communities. So I think the starting point has to be, yes, a dialogue, but a dialogue which is based on respect and love. Recognizing that people have an immense sense of pride, that they're feeling insecure and vulnerable, but they have an awful lot to contribute. It's not going to be an easy conversation. I think it has to be one which talks about what is coming down the line. And as I said, I think based on the Alberta experience, which I would really recommend that people look at. And by the way, my email is there, and people are very welcome to get in contact with me. Starts by talking about security, of saying, look, this is now increasingly, whether you like it or not, looking at what's happening around the world, this is an insecure area. And so therefore we need to be looking at ways of spreading our bets. I think a conversation, generally speaking, talking about closing it down, I think there's a value in having a radical conversation that says that, but I think actually in conversation for communities, that is not going to be productive. But I think a conversation about diversification is. Like, let's get ready. Let's start to get ready now for recognizing that the security in this field has always been very uncertain. Now it's going to become less so. Let's look at a way of transferring skills. I think also there's a case to be made where people are organized, of saying, look, right now, actually, you do have some power. You have some negotiating power to demand a fair, just and funded transition. You have made a contribution of billions, I mean, say with Scottish oil industry, a contribution of billions and billions to the national wealth. You must not allow now, the ground to be cut out from underneath your feet. Whilst you still have an industry, use your bargaining power to demand that there is investment in your livelihoods. But that has to come from accepting that the change is coming. But of course, if you don't do that and you just say, well, we're going to resist this tooth and nail all down the line, you lose your bargaining strength, because then when you finally are forced to come to the conclusion, you're actually defending from a position of weakness. You see what I mean? I mean, when I talk to trades unionists, I think that they kind of like understand this balance of power argument. And I think that's essential, but it has to start by some hard truth. And I think, again, the arguments about saying it's interesting, I mentioned in Alberta, it's everywhere, but in Alberta it's particularly strong, this argument of saying climate change, this is not going to be easy. This is going to be tough. So let's have some tough talk. Let's have some straight talking. And especially mobilizing peer communicators, like people from the oil industry saying to people in the oil industry, this is hard, but we're going to have to face some facts. Our markets are disappearing in front of our eyes. And we need to get ready, and we need to negotiate whilst we still can. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, George, I think but really interesting, I think, and clearly a topic that really affects quite a lot of people here at the conference, a really important one to cover.
Yeah.
Slightly different topic, and forgive me, Rowan, and how can the media corporations talk about the pressures of climate without worrying they're straying into a campaign narrative?
I think they can argue it depends who the media corporations are and where they align themselves politically. I mean, it keeps coming back down to the same framework I suggested before, which is speaking in terms of values and identity. And of course, media organizations are often, especially the print media, very often placed in particular locations on the political spectrum. So they need to be taking ownership of the issue and shaping it in terms of the values of their readership. One of the messages, interestingly, that we find works quite well for people who are locked out of the conventional environmental campaign narrative, and interestingly works just as well for hardcore conservatives and for very dedicated grassroots rank and file trades unionists who will not find that many things necessarily to agree about, is that we need to get involved with and take ownership of this issue because we are necessary. We have a point of view which is underrepresented, and because it's been left for too long to environmentalists. So I don't in any way want to encourage anybody to undermine environmental activism, but to say, actually, we can't sit outside of this. This is far too important. Obviously, also, let's reflect and respond to the science. We can report the science. But going back to my original point right at the beginning, just reporting the science isn't good enough. I think it's the commentators we need to focus on. It's the kind of people who have opinions, who have influence over opinions, and within the wider climate change advocacy movement, we need to be actively encouraging and supporting and tooling people from those different constituencies to speak. So I would love to see, and there has been work, for example, I know scientists have done, to do kind of like hands-on tailored work with columnists, with people who are public commentators. And of course, in the media world, some of the most important people now are not the people in the mainstream media. They're the people who are appearing on TikTok or YouTube and so on. It's really important we reach out to those people and say, hey, let's tell you what's going on, and then you shape it in your own terms for your own viewers.
Thanks, George. And actually, just building on that, we've actually at KSB we're going to be speaking to the National Union of Journalists about a carbon literacy course, just to give journalists some background information, which actually we should be trying all angles, I guess. George, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to give you 2 minutes for this one, so it's a rapid one, but it's a common theme, and I think it is just that common problem about how do we deal with skeptics, and what are your top tips for engaging with people who really are quite skeptical on climate change?
2 minutes, I've got my watch running. Right. Not surprisingly based on very similar principles. I actually have a little video on YouTube if you want to have a look at it on how to speak to a climate change denier, which I did a few years ago, but the principles are much the same. Start from a position of respect. Recognize that you are not going to necessarily win an argument. It's not about winning or losing. It's about flagging up to them that somebody within their social circle, and if it's a family member, maybe somebody they love, you have a lot in common with them, you build on that sense of commonality, has this view. And but you simply present that to them. We very strongly recommend in all communications, and not just speaking of skeptics, but actually for any of you out there communicating, that you try and find language which gives you the ownership of your message. So you don't talk about climate change. It's a huge problem. This is what the scientists say. And you don't say to a climate change skeptic, look, the vast majority of scientists say this. Because when you just get into a tit for tat over the science, which in some cases, if they're well educated, they may have more tools at their disposal than you, and you get into this whole empty argument. You just say, this is what I think, and this is why I think it, and this is why it's important to me. So, for example, when I personally, I'm a bit privileged in this because I've met a lot of people. So when I speak of a climate skeptic, I don't argue with science. I say, I have met some of the leading scientists in this field, and I have huge respect for their integrity and their authority and their commitment to public service. And therefore, I refuse to accept that those people have been deceiving us. And I say, I've also met some of the professional climate change skeptics, and I wouldn't trust them 1 inch. And I can speak there from my experience of meeting the communicator. So it's a kind of reflection of a communicator. I think you need to recognize you're not going to win it, but you can at least flag up for them the fact that somebody can speak in a very open, honest, trusting, and respectful way. And you recognize we're all on a journey. So you just say, maybe, well, I wasn't too sure about that either, Uncle Dave, but over time I've come to recognize this is a serious problem, and and it takes a while and it's challenging. So you show them a journey. I guess the final thing to say on that, because I'm over 2 minutes now, is to say we actually have on our website, we have a whole resource on how to have a climate change conversation that we have been working on and building these principles into. We're developing courses on this as well. So please have a look at that. You'll see the principles in there.
George, couldn't have asked for a more stimulating first session. I mean, my mind's whizzing all over the place, and it certainly provided a lot of thought for me. As I say, behavioural science, I think, actually is something I'm particularly interested in, particularly pertinent to the wider range of activity that Keep Scotland Beautiful is in. But I think clearly from all the questions that are coming in, how that sense of how we influence people in the type of work we're doing and the change that we're wanting people to make around this subject is critical. So, George, on behalf of everyone, we can't give you a round of applause, but a huge thanks for joining us this morning and providing that.
Thank you so much for having me.
Input. Thank you. Delighted now to. Thank you, George. Delighted now to pass to Alistair Seaman, who'll take us through to the details of the next session.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, George. My goodness, what a flying start. And there's lots more of that to come. So stay with us, please. And let me just talk you through what's happening next. We're not back together here on the main stage until after lunch. We have a short comfort break coming up now. And then after that, at 10:50, we move into our first workshop sessions. You'll see on the left-hand side of your screen a sessions button. That's the place to go. We have 7 workshops. You can go to whichever one you want. There's no need to pre-register. Golden rule, please, when you join those workshops, a blue button will appear on your screen asking if you would like to request to share your screen and your audio. Please do not press that blue button. There will be an opportunity for you to come on screen later on in the workshop session if you want to ask a question and you're happy for that to be recorded. But please don't do that at the start. That will make life much easier. Straight after those workshops, we have our table talk sessions, which are also in the same sessions place. They're really like small workshops. What we're trying to do there is create more of that sort of intimate feel of really being at an event. So there's a maximum number of 15 people per table. If you get there late, you'll not be able to join your table of choice. So please don't delay if you know where you want to go. If the one you've gone to first is full, then there are plenty more to choose from. There are 19 of those happening. Please do click the blue button at the table talk. If you're comfortable to come on camera, we'd love to see you. These sessions aren't being recorded, but we want to create more of that sense of being together around a table, having a chat. You have a facilitator in the table talk who will explain how everything's going to work there. After that, we have a break for lunch. Please do not waste your time by checking your emails at lunchtime. There are far more useful and enjoyable things you can do while you're at our conference. I would really strongly encourage you to get to our networking area, our marketplace area. And if you've not yet discovered the networking function, down the bottom left of your screen, you'll see a button there. And that gives you the opportunity to meet somebody for 3 minutes and have a conversation with someone else who's also very keen to meet somebody new and say hello. And you can go through that 3-minute cycle as often as you like, or you can move off and do something else. And please also do visit our marketplace section. We've got some fantastic exhibitors there, partner organisations that work very closely with us through the CCF. A number of our CCF project groups are also there to talk about what they do. We've got colleagues from KSB running a KSB stand. So please make sure you spend some time browsing around there. And a final photo competition. Thank you to those of you who are sending in the photos from your window. We would also like to see a photograph of your lunch. So whether you are proud that you've pulled off a culinary masterpiece, whether you're reverse proud that you have the dullest lunch in the conference room, whether you've got the lowest carbon lunch, whether you've got a lunch you've grown by yourself, whatever kind of lunch you have, will you send a photograph, please? Can you tweet it or send it by email? And again, Tim will pop the details of that in the chat box. Thank you. Keep the pictures from your windows coming in also. And for those of you who've not yet clicked on the poll on the right-hand side of the screen, we want to see where people are from today. Thank you to those of you who have, but please do click on that if you've not yet done it. All right, so short comfort break, back at 10:50 for workshops. Golden rule, please don't press the blue button in the workshop. Please do press the blue button when you get to your table talk. Enjoy the rest of your morning, and we look forward to seeing you back here on the main stage at 1:55 for our next stimulating keynote speaker. And bye for now.